Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, we celebrate 2 years of the podcast. And we finish our conversation with Danny Anderson and the ideas of Christianity in horror films. Plus, scripture and nerdy news as always, and we'll get to all of that right after this. It's so hard to believe that it's been 2 years since I started the Christian Nerds Unite podcast. The show has changed and grown so much since then. I don't know if I've gotten any better at this, but I think the show has become better since I switched over from just my thoughts and rantings to doing interviews with such amazing nerdy believers like Danny Anderson. And I can't wait to see what the next 2 years are going to bring. Now let's read some scripture. Zechariah 4, 6-10. Then he said to me, "This is what the Lord says to Zerubbabel. It is not by force nor by strength, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Nothing, not even a mighty mountain, will stand in Zerubbabel's way. It will become a level plain before him. And when Zerubbabel sets the final stone on the temple in place, the people will shout, 'May God bless it, may God bless it.' Then another message came to me from the Lord. Zerubbabel is the one who laid the foundation of this temple, and he will complete it. Then you'll know that the Lord of heaven's armies has sent me. Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin, to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. Do not despise these small beginnings." Zechariah is seeing a vision of the second temple being built, and many would end up moaning and complaining that it was not as grand as the first temple that Solomon had built. But God said not to worry. He had bigger things in store. This second temple, this is where Jesus preached. This small place, this small temple, would be the site of some of the greatest happenings in the New Testament. We might see it as small, but God sees the bigger picture. We need to take this advice as well. Maybe our ministry seems small, but we're only seeing the temporal, what is here and now. We can't see God's grand design yet. So I want to encourage you to keep moving forward in your life and in your ministry. Don't worry about how small it seems. God has something bigger in store, and I, for one, will be happy to have been just a small part of what it is. And I hope you will too. Now let's get to some nerdy news. According to director James Mangold, moviegoers will see a de-aged Harrison Ford in the upcoming 5th installment of the Indiana Jones franchise. Ford, upon seeing the effect, said, "This is the first time I've seen it where I believe it." And he doesn't seem to want to be that age again, saying, "I'm glad I've earned my age." Based on the interview with the director, expect there to be a major time jump, with the film starting somewhere between The Last Crusade, set in 1939, and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, set in 1957, and then a jump to something like 1969. As much as I love the first 2 Indiana Jones films and Harrison Ford, I think it's probably time to hang up the hat and the whip. Associated Press has confirmed that Jason David Franks, who played the Green Power Ranger, Tommy Oliver, on the 90s show Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, has died at the age of 49. His manager, Justine Hunt, asked for privacy for his family and friends during this horrible time as we come to terms with the loss of such a wonderful human being. Frank had been an outspoken believer, as well as a martial artist, expert, and an MMA fighter, and was inducted into both the World Karate Union Hall of Fame and the Black Belt Hall of Fame. Disney has named Bob Iger as CEO again, replacing Bob Chapek, who only served for 2 years. Disney said that Iger has agreed to serve as CEO for 2 years with a mandate from the board to set the strategic direction for renewed growth and to work closely with the board in developing a successor to lead the company at the completion of his term. Iger was previously CEO for 15 years, overseeing major acquisitions like Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, and Fox. What will this mean for the juggernaut that is Disney? It's hard to say, but if Iger's previous track record holds, expect some major expansions. Marvel's Blade film has found a new director in Helmer Jan de Mange, and Michael Starsbury is set to write a fresh script. Originally scheduled to start production this month, Marvel has chosen to start from scratch after the original director stepped down. We expect Blade to go into production mid to late 2023, and it's still slated for its September 6th, 2024 release date. But with the rewrite, we could see that pushed back to early 2025. Today, I want to share the second half of my interview with Danny Anderson. Danny has his PhD in English and teaches literature and film classes at Mount Aloysius College. Danny and I had a long conversation about faith and horror films, so long, in fact, I had to split it into 2 episodes. So if you missed last week's episode, you'll want to go back and check that out. Now, let's get into part 2 of our interview. One of my favorite movies, and I question whether it's horror, or whether it's suspense, or whether it's a police drama, which is Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And where do you think that falls? Is that a horror genre movie?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that Hannibal Lecter is a monstrous figure. He's without explanation. Now, there is the Hannibal Rising, where it seeks to explain why he eats people, right? Which I actually love that book and that movie too. But I'm a huge Thomas Harris fan, and I love the whole Hannibal Lecter universe. My favorite TV show was the Mads Mikkelsen Hannibal on NBC from about 10 years ago now. And so I would actually say Hannibal Lecter is a figure of horror, and he's very weird. He is somebody who he's uncanny, if not that. He looks entirely human, but he's obviously not. And so there's something uncanny about him. So he does fit into the kind of template of a horror figure. And I know in that movie, so it won all the Oscars, right? And so horror fans want to claim it because it was like a moment of legitimacy for the genre, right? And so maybe that's why I'm overly, but it certainly, any kind of work of art can exist in more than one genre at a given time, right? And so it's definitely horror, it's definitely suspense, it's definitely police procedural. You're right.
And I think, are there any movies that are only horror movies?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like that. I'm tempted to say, of course there is, but then I have to think about it, right? So I'm trying. It's hard for me to think in abstract terms. I'm just running through my Rolodex of individual movies that I would think are exactly only horror films.
Like, is Halloween a horror movie for horror movie's sake? Okay. Or the Jason, we've got Halloween. Kind of the two big are Halloween and Friday the 13th,
right?
Probably.
And I would say Halloween. The sequels, I think, are much more easily defined as straight horror. Okay. Although, now that I say that, that's not necessarily true. A lot of the idea of you can almost see them as like family dramas too. Like particularly the new David Gordon Green requel series that's currently being out right now. That's currently out now. Those are the structure of those films are about the protection of family too, right? And so there's a way in which it's a horror version of a family drama, a domestic drama, if you will. But the original one,
then you have Nightmare on Elm Street, which is kind of the teen angst movie.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that it's really hard to imagine a movie that is only doing one thing. Um, and so, yeah, Halloween for the original, John Carpenter's original 1978, reads very much like a Hitchcockian suspense film,
Mm-hmm.
far more often than it on screen than it does a horror film, right? It's mostly
Mm-hmm.
Michael lurking in the background somewhere, right? And so nothing's really happening. And so it like you definitely can consider that a suspense film as
But
well.
aren't those the best movies
Well,
where
yeah,
the monster is there in theory, but we don't necessarily see them on screen?
yeah. I mean, Hitchcock's idea is that the anticipation of the explosion is much scarier than the explosion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing there's a gun under the table is suspenseful, and it makes you have an emotional impact more than the gun going off. And so,
Yes.
yeah, I think that John Carpenter definitely agrees with that in his filmmaking in general. And yeah, it can be understated in that way, and I think much more effective because of it.
So there's another idea that I have rolling around in my head. This idea of what makes something a monster movie versus a horror movie. We have Universal, the classic Universal monsters, but then we have movies that are like Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, it's kind of a monster movie, but is it a horror movie?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's similar to the difference between sci-fi and horror. Uh,
Mm,
and it's kind of like the old I forget which Supreme Court justice said it, but about pornography, it's like I know it when I see it, right? And so
yeah,
and so I'm not sure. Oh gosh, that's a really good question. So what makes Jurassic Park not a horror film? I don't think anybody would watch that and think that's a horror film.
exactly.
Yeah, it has
But
monsters in it.
it has elements of horror
Yeah,
film, ideas.
yeah. I think so. So there's a philosopher in general, and he did do a book on the philosophy of horror. His name's
Mm,
Noel Carroll, an English philosopher, and he. I don't entirely agree with this definition because I'm not a philosopher and I just think about things differently than he does. But he's looking for this big category to describe what horror is, and for him, it's a curiosity that is triggered by disgust. And so you're
mm,
disgusted by something because it violates your conception of what reality is or what normal is. And so
mhm,
a bloody, a disfigured serial killer or something like Jason triggers a sense of disgust, right? And then you watch the movie because you're curious as to how that resolves itself. Okay.
mm,
Dinosaurs we know exist. No, it's odd that they exist in our time. But the movie
mm,
explains how that happens, right?
yeah.
So dinosaurs are not like necessarily a figure of disgust because we know they exist. Godzilla doesn't exist. Godzilla is like
Mhm,
that's not real, and so that's sort of a difference between Godzilla and Jurassic Park, right? And so you can more easily throw Godzilla films
mhm.
into horror film. That would be off the top of my head an initial way to begin this conversation, at least. But yeah, there's a way in which and yeah, like any kind of crime film I mean, there's like
Mhm.
serial killer films that I wouldn't call horror
Yes.
films because we know there are crazy people out there that do things for evil reasons, right? Um,
Seven,
yes, yeah,
it
exactly.
would be, one of those. Is this a horror film or is this a police procedural? Well, yes.
And Seven, because of its aesthetics, though, pushes that distinction to the limits. It does
Hmm.
bleed over into horror because of the nature of the killings. They're
Yeah.
much more intricate and they're much more kind of revolting in a lot of ways than just like Dirty Harry. The guy's just shooting people like from with
Right.
a sniper rifle. Like that's not. I mean, he's monstrous, but I wouldn't call him a monster, right? And so
Right.
that's one way. And of course, there aren't like firm answers to this. There are movies
Hmm.
like Seven that purposefully lean into that
Hmm.
gray area, and so they
Right.
kind of exist in both realms in that way.
So the my big question, and this has been a question of mine for a long time, because I've seen so many horror films that have put in Christian iconography or the moral story of good versus evil is a big part of it. Do you think there is a possibility, a good way to create a quote unquote Christian horror film? And I ask this as a general idea because I've been curious.
Yeah.
Also because I actually have some friends that have worked on a film recently that they haven't been willing to come on my podcast yet because they're not sure how they're going to market their film.
Right.
And it is a horror film, yes, but it's actually based on some Christian writings.
Yeah.
And they're questioning whether or not they should lean into that because they're afraid they'll get too much pushback and not have an audience for their film. But is Christian horror something that can happen?
It is. I absolutely think it is. And in fact, my mom is not a fan of me being a horror fan, right? My mom, so she's always been like, she's put up with it, right? But in some ways, I quote unquote credit her and my religious upbringing for my interest in this. When I grew up in the 70s, it was 80s, it was a big time for kind of like Mark of the Beast, Great Tribulation,
yes,
end times theology, right? And
88 reasons Jesus is coming in 88.
I did a podcast about that booklet because I remember that week in March or whatever, April, that it was supposed to happen.
Absolutely.
And I remember being freaked out all the time, right? That entire week, every time the school bell rang, I would freak out. But
we must be similar ages.
Yeah, that was I was in high school when that happened, when those dates happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then of course it didn't happen, and so he added another reason. So there was next year 89 reasons, right? Oh, I forgot about this factor, right? But that whole like Mark of the Beast, the whole Left Behind, that's a horror story, right? I mean and so not only the interpretation of that, and I know that's a controversial subject. I'm sure I have controversial opinions about that for many of your listeners, so I won't get into whether that's all real or not. Okay,
we don't tend to go in too deeply on theology on this podcast,
right? Yeah, and so and I wouldn't want to do that anyway, just because it's provocative. And so, but the idea is that it's a horror story. The way that interpretation fed through the imagination, and honestly, Stephen King's Stand is kind of a version of it, if you think about it. And so there's that. There's also actual stories from the Bible that fit like horror films. The possession stories of the New Testament are all horror narratives. I would say the story of Job is a horror narrative. The entire book of Ecclesiastes is somebody who's going through an existential crisis, like any number of people in a horror film, and any number of the Genesis stories about the Nephilim and all that. Those and the terrible things that Israelites do to tribes that they conquer, right, and vice versa. So there's horror built into the Christian faith. Okay. And so yes, there's definitely a possibility for Christian horror films. Now, it's a separate question. Like the idea of like Christian media complicates it. So, and that's probably a subject for another podcast. Whether something's marketed as a Christian horror film is a separate question than whether a horror film is essentially a Christian horror film. And I would say that The Exorcist is definitely a Christian horror film. And there's a documentary on Shudder. I can't remember the name of the documentary. It's about the making of The Exorcist, and it's like an extended kind of interview with Friedkin, the director of that. And it was basically a spiritual experience for him to make that movie, right? And he was, it was absolutely an expression of his faith, that movie, The Exorcist. And so, that already exists, whether someone's marketing it to Christians or not, right? That's kind
Hmm.
of like a separate question.
Right.
Um, but also, I would say one of my favorite horror movies, and it's probably my favorite Hammer movie. Hammer was this English studio in the 60s that began by kind of redoing a lot of the Universal movies,
Hmm.
50s and 60s. The Christopher Lee Dracula movies and the Peter Cushing Frankenstein movies. Christopher Lee was in a movie called The Devil Rides Out, and that was based on a book by Dennis Wheatley. And that book is explicitly very conservative. I mean, the book is actually quite racist. It's conservative in its Christianity, and it's like far right politics, if you will. But the movie's my favorite Hammer movie, actually, and it is explicitly a very Christian movie. It's a very don't get involved in Satanism. That's kind of what
Hmm.
Wheatley's intention was in the with the book. But the movie, I think, gets rid of a lot of the racism, not all of it, of course, but it does maintain its like conservative theology, I would say.
Mm.
Wheatley had conservative politics that ventured into racism, as in addition to his conservative theology, right? And so the movie does a nice job of kind of smoothing over some of those rougher edges. But it is my favorite actual Hammer movie. So, and it already exists. So yeah, not only is it possible, they actually are out there.
Great. So, I guess a quick question, just to kind of start wrapping this up. Two questions.
Yeah.
Number one is, do you have a favorite horror film? It's like, if I just want to sit down and watch a horror film because I want to enjoy it, this is the one I enjoy.
Well, I mean, some of it. So, if I'm making a recommendation, I have to consider your sort of your tastes, right? And so, yeah.
What is yours? Your
Well,
favorite?
American Werewolf in London is my favorite kind of movie in general. And it's
Mhm.
weird because I'm not sure it's my favorite actual horror film. I think if I had to like limit myself to the genre, I might go somewhere else.
Okay.
And I would probably go with John Carpenter's The Fog. That's
Okay.
my favorite of his movies. It's got this very it's it's subtle, right? And so
Hmm.
if you're interested in like adrenaline, you're probably not going to like that movie, right? But
Right.
it's very, I think, not only theologically challenging. There's an interesting priest character played by Hal Holbrook in that movie, that is kind of dealing with the sins of the past, and he kind of
Mm.
bears them on himself in a lot of ways. And so it's got some interesting theological questions that it raises, but it also, I think, asks really profound and necessary social questions about justice and our origins as a society.
Mhm.
I think it's profound in that way. It's got a terrific atmosphere. It takes place in this really beautiful part in California that is both like gorgeous and eerie. There are really interesting female characters in it. Adrienne Barbeau is the kind of main character of the movie, and she's like this radio DJ, and she's super interesting. And I find that movie to be really thought provoking and atmospheric, which is sort of my kind of
Mhm.
personal favorite kind of horror. If I'm looking for something more kind of like, I don't know, thrilly, one of my favorites is Fright Night from 1985.
Oh yeah.
Terrific. It's also a little bit of a horror comedy, but a terrific kind of throwback horror film.
Mhm.
That's kind of takes place in the 80s. The remake of that's also very good with Colin Farrell. And these are some things that I'm throwing out there. If you're interested in kind of contemporary horror films that are important, like I've already mentioned, the films of Jordan Peele.
Mhm.
A24 is it's not a studio, it's more like a distribution company that
Mhm.
distributes artsy fartsy kind of films. So if that's your style, you'll probably find something really interesting in an A24 movie. Particularly Hereditary is one that is recent. That's extremely unsettling. That's the one movie I showed in my class
Mm.
that actually bothers people. They actually get really
Oh
unsettled by
wow.
it. And so to me, that's like the finest horror film in recent years. So those are some movies I'm giving a range rather than just one. It just sort of depends on your capacity and taste. And I do want to say that for Christians who are suspicious of horror films,
Mhm.
and I totally understand, if I do have to make a case, and I sometimes do have to defend myself for
Mhm.
from people for enjoying this kind of thing. people at church often look at me kind of side-eyed about a lot of things, but in particularly this thing, when I publish something, like, so I know some people at church have read it that week, because they'll like sort of look at me a little strange, but like I'll make a case that Christians should go see the movie It, right? That was one of my earlier articles because of some sort of lesson that it can provide Christians, some sort of self-reflective lesson. And I do think that's an important thing. I think that it's one thing to have beliefs and to be sure of those beliefs, but you should always be willing to interrogate those beliefs and make sure that they come from the right place. I mean, we can call something reason in the will of God. I'm quoting Matthew Arnold here, the British Victorian poet here, but one of his statements that what was the hope of reaching people who convincing people of reason and the will of God when they've already got a system that they call reason and the will of God, right? And so he's advocating for a self-interrogation of what we believe to be right and true and good. And so horror films are a way to do that. I mean, they're challenging for a reason. And so I do think that watching a movie that maybe violates some belief that you have about the universe and the good is sometimes a healthy exercise. And so that would be my kind of self-defense. So if you want to watch something that probably won't disgust you or give you nightmares, maybe stick with The Fog, right? But if you want to really challenge yourself, watch Hereditary. And so it depends on your capacity here. So
awesome. Well, my second question was going to be, if somebody wanted to start checking out the horror genre, where should they start? And I think you've kind of answered that.
Yeah, and honestly, if you just want to begin, the Universal classics are all great. And honestly, they read more like dramas to us now. You're not likely to be frightened of Bela Lugosi, right? And
yes,
today, but at the time that people were. But the sort of the Universal cycle is foundational to a lot of this. I really enjoy even more the Hammer cycle that kind of revised it. But yeah, and if now I personally kind of do have the films, and this is clearly because of my upbringing, the films that really do sort of live with me and bother me tend to be the kind of satanic possession kind of films. The Exorcism of Emily Rose was one that particularly caused me some issues for a couple of days. But The Exorcist can do that as well. I very kind of lightly go into those. I don't dive into them head first. I watch them, but I don't watch them in bulk, kind of, right? But those can be very kind of thought-provoking, like faith exercises as well, I would think, is to sort of watch those movies and think about not only how they affirm what you believe about the universe, but how they may challenge what you believe about the universe. And so, yeah, so those are, I mean, I think of it as a spectrum, and you have to kind of count, you have to decide for yourself your capacity to sort of to deal with these sorts of things. So
awesome. Well, any last words on horror and Christian faith?
Like I said, I don't take this as a me shaming you into, well, if you don't like horror, you're not taking your faith seriously, right? I don't believe that. I know there are people who are of no faith that don't really like to watch horror films because of just sort of the way their personality is wired, right? It's not for everybody. But also be careful about underestimating people who do find something interesting in this genre. Don't stereotype them as the guy who just likes blood and guts, and therefore there's something wrong with you, right? People do engage with this in very thought-provoking ways, and sort of, I would say, make room in your churches for people who have these kinds of interests. They're probably thinking very deeply about their faith, and you should take, even if you disagree with the consumption of the films, you should take that as an opening to get to know them and their faith journey as well. And so that would be a kind of a piece of advice I have about horror films. And if you do just enjoy the blood and guts, step back from that and think about more profound questions that might be being posed of you and just, you know, step out of your kind of pure interest in the spectacle and think about what it might all mean. I know that I'm a boring old English teacher, and I annoy people by suggesting that things are significant in other ways than just our pleasure in consuming them, but they are. And I think that horror films can be much more interesting than we allow them to be when we just reduce them to some adrenaline pump for spectacle.
Awesome. Well, Danny, it has been a joy having you on the show today.
Likewise, thank you.
If people want to follow you, keep up with you, where can they follow you at?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Danny P. Anderson. I have all of my writing and my podcasting gets collected at this page called Authory. It's Authory, AUTHORY.com/Danny Anderson. You can find everything I do. There's like a newsletter you can sign up for, and you'll just, if I do something that week, you'll just get an email letting me know that it exists, letting you know that it exists. I probably already know that it exists, but and so there's those are the basic two ways that people can find me, and you can email me through the Authory page as well.
Awesome, and I'll put links to that all down in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Danny, it has been great having you on the show.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
It has been great getting to know Danny Anderson. If you'd like to keep up with what he's doing, follow him on Twitter at Danny P. Anderson or use the links down in the show notes below. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click the bell, click all those links, whatever they are down there, so you can keep up with us as we put out new content. And you can find all of our social links, links to our YouTube channel, and our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. We've changed all of our Patreon levels, and every level has great benefits and makes a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or to partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click support in the menu. Before I go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Ephesians 3. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and how long and how high and how deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with the measure of all the fullness of God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.